Well, we have a verdict. Now what? Hi, I'm Melba Pearson, also known as the Resident Legal Diva, and this is the Daily Diddy, The Aftermath. I was bringing you daily updates on the Diddy trial until we got a verdict, and well, at 10:15 a.m. today, Eastern Standard Time, we got one. So, Diddy was found guilty on 2 counts of transportation for the purposes of prostitution and not guilty on the remaining counts, which was 2 counts of sex trafficking pertaining to Cassie and Jane and 1 count of racketeering. Now, in terms of reaction, I am not surprised in terms of the not guilty in terms of racketeering, because that is just a hard charge for folks to really get their mind around, especially since RICO and racketeering has traditionally been used for gangs, the mob, folks like that, not necessarily a criminal enterprise. Not usually in terms of a corporation business. Even though those prosecutions do happen, they're just not as widely publicized. So that's not something that first comes to mind for folks. And I always said all along that the case for sex trafficking for Jane was going to be a bit weaker just because a lot of her testimony was very muddy. But I was feeling that, that in terms of Cassie, that was going to be a guilty. But okay, I was wrong. But like I always said, transportation for purposes of prostitution, that was a gimme. And I've seen a few questions like, well, but what about the intent? And these were consenting adults. Consent doesn't matter when it comes to transportation for purposes of prostitution. If you flew people to have sex with sex workers, if you flew sex workers someplace with the intent of sleeping with them, end of. That's the charge. Those are the elements, period, end of story. So there was no way he was getting out from under that. And that has a maximum of 10 years in prison per charge. Now, some folks were like, wow, the government really overcharged when it came to racketeering. I got mixed feelings on that. Reason being, after everybody saw the tape of Cassie getting beaten, after all the allegations came out in Cassie's civil lawsuit, then immediately followed by Little Rod's civil lawsuit, listen, the government couldn't just sit there on their hands and not respond to that, right? Because there's a whole host of crimes and bad things that were alleged in those lawsuits. So obviously they had to investigate, right? They couldn't just turn a blind eye. So for folks who are like, oh my gosh, he was being targeted, dude, you put yourself in the frame. It's not that the government went looking for you and made up a whole bunch of stuff. This is stuff you actually did. These are people you actually brutalized. So, I don't see a whole he was framed or anything like that. Now, again, racketeering had to be critical because the big struggle was statute of limitations, because a lot of these things that were in these lawsuits happened 2015, 2016, 2017, and statute of limitations for most charges is 3 to 5 years. So in order to bring all of those issues into the frame, you needed a broader umbrella charge, which was racketeering. So that was probably the strategy of why they went with that particular charge. But again, it's a hard charge for people to get their minds around. And I think they went overboard in terms of giving too many options. So it could be drug trafficking, it could be forced labor, it could be this. Maybe they needed to tighten up which predicate crimes they wanted to focus on and really hone in on that rather than throwing a whole bunch of things at the kitchen sink, including the kitchen sink to see what would stick. So that's where I think things got a little muddy. But also, I got to really talk about this narrative I'm seeing in terms of domestic violence survivors. So there's a narrative out there listen, Cassie got paid, so what's her issue? And yeah, he's been sitting in jail, so whatever. Okay, now, let's be clear. He was not charged with domestic violence. That was not a crime per se that was in the indictment. However, the domestic violence was a tool to get her to do those freak-offs. And again, folks, and they brought Dr. Don Hughes to talk about the cycle of violence, to talk about what goes on in a survivor's mind. But again, domestic violence prosecutions are never clean, right? When you have a domestic violence victim, a survivor, the behavior sometimes is just very hard to explain. And yeah, you're going to have text messages where things are good and they're being lovey-dovey. And then there's going to be text messages of why the hell did you beat me last night? That is the exact mindset and the confusion that goes on in every domestic violence relationship. as well as a narrative in terms of, well, why didn't she leave? She could have gotten up and leave and all of that. If it was me, if I was in that situation, I wouldn't have stayed, da 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 da. Listen, some of y'all, and I heard this from one of my students today, and I gotta like repeat this for y'all, but some of y'all will not tell your barber that the edges weren't right or tell your nail tech that your nails weren't right. So are you really gonna tell the person that you love that, oh yeah, I gotta go, I'm speaking up for myself, da da da? You probably wouldn't, right? And again, people just don't understand the DV mindset. They expect it to be, he hit me once, I turned around, I walked out the door. It is not that simple. So I know this is really hard for folks who have survived sexual violence or domestic violence, because they're watching this and they're like, okay, well, what's the point of me coming forward? Because if Cassie, with all of this power and money and everything and all of this behind her, couldn't make a case stick, what hope do I have? Really quick last point before I talk about sentencing. I had a case when I was a domestic violence prosecutor of a woman who was pregnant and her husband beat her. To the point that I'm telling you, his size 12 boot was imprinted on her belly. Okay? Like on her back. Like literally, you could see it. I had pictures of it. All right. And she still fought me in terms of prosecuting him and would not participate and would not come forward. She wanted him actually in the hospital room while she was giving birth. Now, that's someone who's deep in the cycle of violence and was not ready to leave, right? But at the same token, she called the police at the time he was beating her. So again, these cases are messy, and very rarely do you have that quote unquote ideal victim that people keep, talking about. That doesn't exist. There's no such thing as the ideal victim, all right? So there's that. In terms of sentencing, let me give you what the next steps will be. So what's next is an investigation that's done by the Department of Probation, where they look at his history, they look at him being Diddy, they look at, they talk to friends, family, associates, all of that, and they basically work up a profile of him and submit that to the judge with what they think an appropriate sentence would be. The judge is going to read that, and then there's going to be a sentencing hearing. And both sides, the prosecution and the defense, are going to argue what they think the most appropriate sentence is. Obviously, the defense is going to be asking for no jail time, and if anything, credit for time served for the close to a year he spent in jail. The prosecution is going to want something around 10 years. I see a scenario where he will probably get maybe a little bit of jail time. I could see something like around maybe 2 to 3 years with some probation. I wouldn't be surprised if it ended up being house arrest. That's probably likely, again, because he has no criminal history. A pardon is possible. The president could turn around and do it.